Hi, I'm Lynn Wise, and with me today is Rodger Baker. Today we're going to be talking about the conflict in the South China Sea. So recently, the United States and China have been kind of in this back and forth over U.S. military activity in the South China Sea. And it seems like the conflict is really boiling down to the very definition of what an island is and who has claims over these islands. Can you tell us a little bit about why these islands are important, or this territory is important in the region?
So when we look at the South China Sea, there are a few different issues that are interplaying at the same time. One is very basic. It is access to natural resources. There's a lot of discussion on things like oil and gas, but in reality, for most of the local countries, it's access to maritime protein, to fish, crabs, squid, things of that sort. Second is a question of territoriality. So the Chinese are asserting, and have for a very long time, that this part of the water is their national territory, and therefore they have claim and control over what happens and what doesn't happen within that territory. And then the third aspect, which really comes into how the United States uses it, is the question of freedom of navigation. And that's not only for the United States, but it's for all of the countries in that region. This is an incredibly important shipping lane for goods leaving Asia and going to Europe and the rest of the world, but also for raw materials coming into Asia, including energy.
So what is the argument between China and the U.S.?
The key argument is that China has a long time ago created what is referred to as the 9-dash line. It's sort of an ambiguous space that they say demonstrates where their territorial water is. It's far from the Chinese coastline. It's based off of a few different atolls and small islands and things of that sort that the Chinese claim as their own. And the Chinese interpretation of maritime law is that if this is their territory, then the United States, for example, can't carry out military transit through that space, that China is the one that oversees what happens and what doesn't in that space. For the United States, the question is, should China be allowed to possess this water? Is this international water? And what are the rights of freedom of navigation?
And so who internationally kind of determines these things, and how is that playing into the conflict or dispute, I guess?
So this is the challenge. The Philippines, for example, has taken China to court over some of the islands that China has occupied, that the Philippines claims. China has chosen not to go to court, and therefore is not going to accept the outcome. There are United Nations agreements that define different types of territories and maritime territories that give you certain things like your 12 nautical mile national seas, that give you your 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones, and that even come down to the definition of what is an island.
And so in our most recent analysis about this, we say that the U.S. and China conflict isn't really likely to escalate too far. But recently, Japan has been becoming more assertive in the region. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So one of the things that the United States is doing as it expands its activities and operations in the Pacific, and in this particular part of the Pacific, is to try to draw in more action from its allies. So it's drawing Australia up north of the Indonesian archipelago. It's trying to draw Japan down south into the South China Sea to take a more active role in regional security. Japan in particular has a very strong interest in this because many of its natural resource supplies come straight through the South China Sea. And if China asserts control, even if China says there's still freedom of navigation through that space, the potential for the Chinese to be able to cut off Japanese supply lines becomes very troubling for Tokyo. And so as Japan becomes more engaged, this is actually making China more nervous than the United States being engaged. In some sense, as a large power, the United States is always going to play this role around the world, but it also has some very tremendous constraints in the way in which it acts. It's a distant power. It doesn't necessarily want to be engaged in conflict in the space. And it doesn't claim any of the territory in the same way that Japan does, where Japan has claims and disputes with China in the East China Sea and then is pushing down into the South China Sea for activity. From the Chinese perspective, they see that there's a higher potential for actual confrontation and conflict between Japan and China, and that could draw the United States in.
And how likely is that conflict?
Right now, all of the countries are being very cautious and careful in what they're doing. The problem is that, as we said earlier, this plays into fishing grounds. And the fishing fleets of each of these countries sort of knows that their own nation is very interested in asserting either their role or their control over this territory. And they are at times much more bold in their actions because they feel that their own national Coast Guard or Navy is going to bail them out. So although the countries are working carefully and trying to find a way not to create a war out of this, there are problems in the way in which their civilian fishing fleets may act that can draw them into a greater chance of confrontation or conflict. And one of the things we've seen, for example, in the Yellow Sea is that in maritime clashes between the North Korean and the South Korean military, those are often triggered by fishing vessels.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. We'll be watching this closely. For more on developments in the South China Sea, please visit stratfor.com.